Hi everyone, welcome to chapter 1. We'll have 2 videos. I'll introduce some key concepts and talk about the general philosophy of social psychology. So most of us are familiar with abnormal psychology, or the study of psychological and personality disorders. But social psychology is the study of the average healthy individual. Given this, many argue, well, why do we need to study average healthy people? What's the point? And don't most of us already have a pretty good understanding of the average person as a result of interacting with average people every day? In fact, Fritz Heider argued that most people act as naive psychologists, engaged in the casual study of the everyday average person. We all observe people and attempt to understand why people behave the way they do. The argument was that when we observe people in our lives, our friends, coworkers, or even strangers, we don't see their behavior as random. We have some understanding of what motivates people's behavior, and this understanding comes from personal experiences and observations. But these terms, naive and casual, are important here. And saying that people are naive psychologists, Heider was not trying to insult, but merely he was highlighting the fact that they are not trained psychological researchers and their observations are casual rather than a systematic, structured means of data collection. So social psychologists would use the scientific method instead of casual observations. So back to our question, do we need a systematic scientific study of average human behavior? Does the scientific method give us a better, more accurate, more comprehensive understanding of the average human experience? Let's look at some of these sources of information that are available to naive psychologists. One source of information is accepted truths or folk wisdoms. These are beliefs that are popular within a given culture that are often accepted without question at face value. But can we trust them? They often have little to no scientific proof to warrant their widespread acceptance, and often they provide contradictory accounts of human nature. Take, for example, the popular sayings, birds of a feather flock together and opposites attract. They directly contradict each other. So how do we decide which is correct? Which better reflects the nature of social relationships? Social psych researchers would use the scientific method to collect data to answer this question. The research evidence strongly supports the birds of a feather axiom as descriptive of most social relationships. People tend to seek out similar others and surround themselves with those who share their beliefs, values, and interests. One such study is the McKinnon and colleagues study of physical similarity and seating choice. The research question was simple. Who would participants choose to sit next to? Each participant walked into a room in which people were already seated, and there was a number of open chairs next to various individuals from which they could choose to sit. Researchers recorded where the participant chose to sit. They found that participants were significantly more likely to sit next to someone who was similar in terms of demographics, race, ethnicity, gender, and even similar in terms of very trivial physical characteristics. So if you were a brunette, you were more likely to sit next to another brunette. If you were wearing glasses, you were more likely to sit next to someone who was also wearing glasses. Now you may be thinking, wait a minute, I had voted for opposites attract. That's what I thought was going to be more correct. And I know people who are complete opposites, who are best friends or fell in love. The research is not arguing that this never happens. There are always going to be exceptions to the rule. We just tend to see birds of a feather more often than we see opposites attract. So the birds of a feather is more likely to explain most social relationship formation. But this brings us to our next source of information, which is personal experience. And we may think, how can our own firsthand direct observations be flawed? We're not trying to invalidate your own experiences, but we have to recognize that often personal experiences are limited and highly subjective. In fact, many people recognize this to a point. Social psychology has identified what is called the bias blind spot, the tendency for people to acknowledge that other people's perceptions are subjective and prone to bias, while maintaining that their personal perspective is objective and bias free. So you can read a little bit more about bias blind spot in chapter 4. But all of us filter our experiences through a subjective lens. This is what makes visual illusions so fun. So look at the image here. Do you see an old woman or a young woman? Your perspective could be influenced by a number of different things: your personality, your motivations, goals, your mood, your past experiences. So take this image, for example. When researchers show this to children, they report that they see dolphins. Adults report something very different. So I won't ask you guys what you see, but it's likely that you see something very different based on experiences that you have had as an adolescent or an adult. What's more is that in relying on personal experience, we are not passive observers collecting data, but active participants in the social exchanges. And so we may consciously or unconsciously alter the nature of our experiences and bring about the very things that we were expecting through our actions. So if we look at the self-fulfilling prophecy, it's our tendency to unconsciously bring about our expectations through our own behavior. If I fail to recognize the role that I played in producing the outcome, I may take that outcome as proof of my original beliefs or expectations. If I think you are rude, I may act in a cold and confrontational way, which leads you to be rude in reaction to my confrontational behavior. But when you are, I may say, yep, I knew it all along. I knew you were rude, and your behavior is confirmation of my pre-existing beliefs rather than a result of my own actions. We also find that social mimicry occurs in many social interactions. People unconsciously mimic their interaction partners. The bar graph depicts the results of a lab study. A Confederate, you see here, Confederate rubs face and Confederate shakes foot. A Confederate is someone who poses as a naive participant who pretends to know nothing about the nature of the study, but is actually working with the researcher and acting based on a script. Their role is to elicit a reaction from the true naive participant. Here, they are scripted to either rub their face or shake their foot. And as you can see, in the experimental conditions in which our Confederate rubbed their face, the interaction partner, the real participant, was significantly more likely to engage in that same behavior, rubbing their face. If our Confederate shook their foot, then our interaction partner was significantly more likely to mimic that behavior and also shake their foot. Now, what is fascinating here is that our individual who engages in these subtle nonverbal behaviors may not notice that they are engaging in that behavior, but could notice those types of behaviors, rubbing their face, fidgeting, shaking their foot on behalf of their interaction partner, and form impressions of their interaction partner based on these behaviors. And so, unknown to us, our own behavior, something like fidgeting, could influence our perceptions of others when they are merely mimicking our behavior. All right, so check out the next video in which we'll talk about confirmation bias and belief perseverance.